Welcome everyone to Growth Summit, where we're having all kinds of conversations with folks about what they're working on and how they've grown to where they are today. I'm really excited to speak today with Dru Riley. He's got Trends.vc along with a number of other projects that he's involved with. And I'll hand it off to him to kind of introduce himself and tell you a little bit about what he does.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks for having me. Yeah, so the quick backstory, I'm the founder and CEO of Trends.vc, which is a newsletter and community for bootstrap founders. So we help aspiring bootstrap founders find businesses that they want to work on, and we help people that are currently working on businesses find ways to grow. So some of our recent and upcoming topics that we've done reports on include side project marketing, lead magnets, building in public, and so on.
How did you arrive at this business, right? So you're obviously out there spotting a bunch of trends and making recommendations. How did you spot the trend of your business, or how did you pick that to kind of go all in on?
Yeah, it came from an interesting place because I took a 3-year mini retirement in 2017. And some people assume that when I took that, it was to go all in on building something. But a lot of that time was spent experimenting with things like improv, jujitsu, picking up new hobbies and habits. And it wasn't until I'll say about 2.5 years in where money started to run thin and I needed to figure something out. So I'm a software developer by trade, and I spent a lot of time looking at SaaS businesses, different SaaS businesses that I wanted to start. But I kept stopping, not because they didn't seem promising, but because it didn't seem like something I could stick with for, let's say, 10 years. So I kind of inverted the formula, if you will. And with Trends.vc, it was something that it felt like I could stick with for a long time, even if I had to go back to full-time work or working for someone else. And that was the missing thing, where it felt like if I could stick with it, then I could figure out the monetization piece, because that wasn't obvious. And if we dig a level deeper and ask, what was it about it that it felt like you could stick with it? And I think it was the comparative analysis. If you look at some of our reports, we compare seemingly unrelated areas. And I love seeing those connections and those through lines between seemingly unconnected areas, and other people appreciate it as well. And that was the big bet there, that other people would appreciate these through lines and connections.
So when you started, were you already writing content and doing this analysis? Were you publishing it already? Was this a new skill that you were developing? Tell me about that kind of transition from jujitsu to actually getting this started. Like, what did those steps look like, and was this net new for you?
Yeah, so it was interesting because a few months before Trends.vc started, I released something called the B2B SaaS Marketing Playbook. And it didn't get a lot of attention at the time, but a lot of the older things that I published, people are now just rediscovering and sharing now. But if you look at that B2B SaaS Marketing Playbook, you'll notice that I'm comparing Tesla to, let's say, GetResponse. These, again, seemingly unrelated areas. So there was that building of that muscle. One problem that I ran into in releasing that playbook was that I released a chapter each week. And a lot of your audience may know Harry Dry from Marketing Examples. And we started within a few weeks of each other, me on the B2B SaaS Marketing Playbook and him on Marketing Examples. And it was interesting because both of us were compounding, but I ran out of runway once the playbook was done. I think there were 13 chapters, but he had this compounding thing where you can expect something each week from him. And that's why I realized that that was a missing piece. And that's something that I made sure to do differently with Trends.vc. I didn't know that it would be Trends.vc, but I knew that I needed this sort of infinite game where the compounding wouldn't end. Whereas if you release a book chapter by chapter, eventually that compounding ends unless you follow it up with something else. So there was this practice or this muscle being built, but it wasn't a direct line to Trends.vc.
Right. And you mentioned that you were a software engineer by trade.
Mm-hmm.
Where did the entrepreneurship thing kind of kick in, right? I'm just thinking about our audience. I think there's a lot of folks that might have day jobs, might be kind of working in a business, but they want to start something. Like, how did you transfer your skills from being a software engineer to being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I would say the entrepreneurship thing came first, where in middle school, I'm selling candy. In high school, I'm selling clothes and electronics. And I
Got it.
actually went to school as an accounting major. And about a year before graduation, I ended up switching to IT. And I think it may have been a Netflix case study that we did in college where I just saw the power of software businesses compared to, let's say, businesses with high marginal costs, if you will. And there was also another element in accounting where you nailed it perfectly. You said they're working in businesses instead of, well, I don't know if you said working on, but that's the thing. I wanted to work on businesses. I wanted to build businesses. Whereas a lot of accounting felt like you were sort of managing existing resources instead of creating new possibilities and building on what was there. So yeah, I remember like that case study pretty specifically. And a few weeks later, I went over to the IT department and switched majors.
Okay, interesting. So you already had a bit of an entrepreneurial bend when you went into your career. Was this was Trends.vc like your first startup, let's say, like where you kind of went all in on something?
Yeah, I think it's the first time that I had the opportunity to go all in on something. There were things that I guess time-wise, I wouldn't even say time-wise I was all in on, but sort of could afford me the ability to go full-time, multi-year on it. There wasn't something where like we got funded by Y Combinator and it just didn't work out or anything like that. But there were tons of like software related things that I tried, but nothing that really gained traction in a way that Trends.vc has.
Cool. So if I'm kind of piecing together your journey, you went on this kind of early mini retirement, did a bunch of self-exploration, found something that you felt you could be passionate about for an extended period of time, and then decided to kind of pursue that. What were some of the first steps or milestones in the pursuit of that, right? And then if you can let me know if it was just you that started it or how quickly you brought on either employees or partners. I imagine that'll be one of the milestones as well, but just trying to figure out how long you were flying solo for.
Yeah, I'm just trying to jot this out to outline it. I haven't thought about this in a while.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing I have to mention is the mastermind that I was in at the time called 0 to 1. And I met them at an Indie Hackers meetup. So we were sort of a spin out of the Indie Hackers meetup where Indie Hackers in Atlanta, they met on a monthly basis and we met on a weekly basis each Friday. And I was in that mastermind for a few weeks and ended up throwing up the idea that I've been sitting on for maybe a month or a month and a half. And people were pretty neutral / ambivalent to it. So the next milestone would have to be actually publishing the first report. And then all of a sudden it clicked. I guess sometimes you have to show people things instead of sort of just describing it. I'm not even sure if I understood what it was because I hadn't put pen to paper or key. I hadn't like tried to spec it out yet. So once people saw it, they got it. The next milestone may have been around discovering the like main channel of growth, especially early on, which was around Twitter threads. The reports are a form of sort of structured research where there are these sections that you know to expect in each report, and that lends itself to Twitter threads. So we also mention a lot of people and a lot of companies in reports. So that was also another way to sort of piggyback on their audiences. When you get featured in something, most people feel proud and they want to reshare that. So in a way, we were able to piggyback on their audiences. So that kind of as a growth lever was discovered, and I would call that a milestone. What else? Monetization.
Can we pause there actually and just talk about that? I think that is such a critical milestone in starting a new thing, either for a solo entrepreneur or co-founders or what have you, is identifying and finding that first growth channel, that first growth opportunity. How am I going to start getting some feedback, getting people to experience what it is I'm putting out into the world? Were you already active on Twitter? Was this the first channel you experimented with? Did you try a number of things that maybe didn't work? Maybe tell me about how you stumbled on this idea of the threads and being able to link back to other folks and have them share it. Like, how did you arrive there, and what things maybe didn't work out?
Yeah, so I wasn't active on Twitter. There were probably, at the time that I posted the report, or around that time, there may have been 4 or 5 months where I didn't tweet at all, months where I wouldn't reply to anyone's tweets. So I don't consider I wouldn't say that I had an established audience on Twitter at the time, but I think this strategy is perfect for people that may have 20 or 30 followers. If you can communicate clearly or concisely, again, highlighting and featuring other people's work. The reason why it felt like Twitter made sense in retrospect is because everyone else in the mastermind were all in on Twitter, very, very active on Twitter. So that was sort of, instead of sending like a group email to those people, that was my way of announcing it. And I could just tag them and thank them, for giving feedback early on or being, inspiring it or whatever. So I think that's why Twitter came to mind there. And no other channels come to mind early on. One thing I will say a mistake was that we weren't collecting emails for the first 6 or 7 weeks, and it just didn't occur to me to collect emails. So I think there was like a little bit of momentum that was lost there. And once we get to like employees, but specifically monetization, I do have an answer for sort of failed starts in terms of things that we tried that didn't work as well.
Okay, so the Twitter channel discovery and the way you went about it was fairly organic and intuitive, based on, well, these are the people I'm already engaging with. This is kind of where they hang out. I want to find more people like them, so go to where the attention is. It makes a ton of sense. Okay, maybe let's take it to the next milestone. So you started to get some visibility, started to get some attention through Twitter. What happened from there? At this point, you're still writing the reports yourself, doing all of that research, putting that work out into the world. What happened after that?
Yeah, so the next milestone would be around monetization. And you have people, especially early on, if something is growing at a fairly healthy rate, where people are saying, oh, I pay for this, I pay for this, I pay for this. And the lesson I learned was that they were right in spirit, but almost no one without exception that said they would pay for it ended up paying for it. But other people, it was true for other people. And we definitely had a false start around monetization. So I believe it was around report 11. So early on, they were weekly reports. So I can say week 11, if you will, where I'd done a report on paid newsletters. And there's a saying, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that the person that learns the most is a teacher, like if you're teaching other people. So I had to synthesize all of this knowledge. And I saw back-to-back examples and putting that report together that made me confident that this may work out as a model of monetization for us. And the route that I chose at first was to do a free report and then alternate with a paid report. And I announced that with the release of a free report and said, hey, you can pre-order the next report here, and no one signed up. So once I saw that there was basically like a deadline response to that, I pivoted before that report even came out. And when the report was released, half of the report was visible, and then the other half of the report was paid. And then things took off and started selling in such a way that even though I was running out of money out of mini retirement, I just had this feeling, this very strong feeling, that I wouldn't have to go back to get a job. Like if things could at least maintain at this pace, then we would be okay. And that turned out to be true. So about, I think 6 months after that, there were certain tasks like staging newsletters, uploading things to WordPress, that I realized these were things that didn't require any specific knowledge, or that you didn't have to have a special skill set to do. And we brought on our first operations person, I'd say about 8 months in total, from the publishing of the first report until that first contractor employee was brought on. Yep.
And what was it? What was the signal to you that it was time and you had the confidence there? I don't know if it was like a revenue thing or just a time allocation thing. I think that's a very big hurdle for a lot of entrepreneurs, early stage entrepreneurs that I speak to, is like, it's one thing when it's you or maybe you and a co-founder building something and nobody's taken home a paycheck yet and you're putting your time and equity in. It's another thing when you're like, all right, I'm going to hire somebody, I'm kind of responsible for their paycheck and I got to make payroll now on a monthly basis. What gave you the confidence to pull that trigger?
Yeah, it was almost, I wouldn't say the opposite of confidence, but I have this habit of comfort challenges where if something makes me uncomfortable, then I almost have to do it within reason, right? You don't want to have survival risk here, but there's usually some type of signal there if something makes you uncomfortable. But what was the, I guess, sort of initiative before that? What was the thing before that? I think it was the context switching, because before we brought on our first team member, I launched the community. And before the community was launched, I was able to spend, I'd say most of my days, 80% of my days, just researching and writing, and I was in bliss. And after the community launched, context switching started to become a big problem where even if, let's say in total, these tasks all take 8 hours now, the amount of context switching, it sort of takes you time to ramp up and get in flow. And that became a big problem. So if I could reduce the amount of context switching, I realized that I could gain some of my productivity back. And I think that was the big drive. But having, like you talked about, being responsible for other people's pay, even though in previous roles as a software engineer, I'd done interviews, I've made hiring decisions, things like this. It's another thing where you can sort of like split up the accountability, but when it's all on your back, that's a different level of like weight or a different amount of weight. So that was the uncomfortable part. But again, it was comfort challenges at the end of the day that I had to realize that one thing I told myself with comfort challenges is that no matter how it turns out, the point isn't to succeed, it's just to do the thing. And if you did the thing, you succeeded. It's an experiment. It may fail, it may succeed, but then you have that information after it's been done, you know?
How did you go about hiring that first person? Again, hiring is challenging.
Yep.
The person you hire is going to be a big part of the culture that you're developing. Some people just aren't even thinking about this and they just need to get someone to get stuff done. Other people are a little bit more conscious of it. What was your process for picking what are the things that I should hire somebody to do versus what I should do? Maybe tell me like practically how you thought through that.
Yeah, it's hard to go back. I journal a lot. I have my journal here. I've been taking notes during our whole conversation. I journal a lot. So I imagine at that time, I had a short list of recurring tasks that could just be thrown over the wall if you want to put it that way. If you train someone to do it, and it can just be out of sight, out of mind at that point. So I'm sure I had that list at the time. What also helped was I have an accountability partner. I actually met him at the same Indie Hackers meetup that the mastermind spun out of. And he's always been like much further along than I am in the entrepreneurial journey. So a lot of things that I'm struggling with, I'm able to just like hit him up. We talk each Monday, hit him up and like just get his thoughts on it. I think the confidence or him like being in sort of understanding what I've been going through the whole time up to that point, his confidence that it was time to hire also helped out a lot. And also a tip for people that are running newsletters or media companies. I just told this to Nico from Fellery because he's looking to hire a writer right now. One thing that's always helped us is that when we're hiring, we just use the newsletter as a channel to hire. We've never posted to a job board. Other people who have job boards will sometimes ask for permission or just go ahead and post the role. But that helps out a lot. And the upside there is that you have people that are familiar with your voice since you're not going to a random job board and trying to explain or sell yourself. You still have to sell yourself, but you already subscribe to the newsletter, so they more or less understand the mission and the values.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like, and I want to dive into that a little bit. It sounds like although you launched this on your own, you seem to have built up a fairly good support network around yourself. You know, you mentioned, the monthly mastermind, these weekly meetups with a smaller group. Now you're talking about an accountability kind of partner. Was this something that you did in your previous life? Was this something that you did consciously because you were going off on this entrepreneurial venture? And how did you start that? Like what pushed you to seek those things out?
Yeah, it's almost the opposite, where in my previous life, I was always like, I'm extremely introverted. So I was always the person like in my head, in books, but not going to meetups, not, putting myself out there and meeting other people. And I think that's another reason why I believe I was 28 or 29 at the point that Trends.vc started to take off, but that's why, relatively speaking, it took so long. But as soon as I had that community, and I call it ambient inspiration, where you don't necessarily have to get your friend who's also a founder to give you a motivational speech. You just see based on his behavior, that this is, something that you should probably do or try, or you see them putting themselves out there, and you just feel inspired to do the same naturally. So I don't believe in regrets, but if I did, that was one big regret, that I wish I would have put myself in these environments a lot sooner. And I remember it probably started around the time that I joined the Indie Hackers online community before I went to meetups. understanding that that was a missing piece, and just sort of pattern matching with other founders who have been successful. They had that community around them, and that was something that I was missing. And if it made me uncomfortable, maybe it's not this extreme, but it felt like you can either fail and be introverted and like not put yourself out there, or you can put yourself out there and see what happens.
Yeah, that's a big leap, and it seems like it worked out for you. I know myself, I was kind of similar. I was always kind of going it alone. I think all the bosses, when I did work in companies, most of the bosses I had taught me a lot of what, like, how I didn't want to be, or what things not to do, when I'm off doing my thing. And so I never really seeked outside mentorship or anything. Just I never really had that kind of experience. But later into kind of launching my first agency, I got into like a leadership group, and we had kind of have a forum on a monthly basis, and they've done a really great job of curating who's in it. And it's this shared experience of sharing, what are you going through and what challenges, has been really transformational for me. And I have a similar regret that I wish I did this much earlier in my career, because I feel like I would have been able to just move a bit faster and learn a bit quicker, and be able to stress test some of my ideas, and frankly probably just manage my anxiety a little bit better. I have some anxious tendencies, and I think being able to speak out loud is very therapeutic, and especially when people are like, yeah, I know you, I've been there myself, and it's incredibly valuable. Would you recommend that that's something that early founders do, whether they're like almost at any stage of their journey in terms of becoming an entrepreneur?
Absolutely. Like, I can't say that enough. One thing I was going to add, whether you asked that question or not, was about 30 minutes before our chat, I was preparing for, I have 3 masterminds coming up, because we now do masterminds inside of the Trends Pro community. And I was preparing for those masterminds. And one question we asked is, what's your North Star? What's that goal that sort of exceeds your week-to-week activities? What's that thing that you're sort of aiming for, selling towards? And things feel pretty good right now. We just kicked off hiring for 2 roles. We have some promising candidates, and I wasn't sure what my own North Star was. So by trying to articulate that, it's like I'm helping myself. And that kind of goes to your point of, sometimes the feedback doesn't have to be direct, or doesn't have to be prescriptive, but just by you expressing or thinking out loud, you solved your own problem, or you see other people struggling with similar problems. And excuse my language, but we tend to see other people's shit easier than we see our own. So it's just like, if someone else is struggling with this, you may have the same problem, but it's hard to get out of your head. And it becomes obvious if I hear Ian describing his problem. It's like, oh, this is what you should do. It's like, no, this is what you should do as well. So that happens a lot in masterminds.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to chat about one more milestone, and then we'll kind of pivot a little bit. At what point and how long into your journey were you finally like, okay, I've kind of made it. This is like a legit thing. I'm on the right path. We're going to keep growing. Like, how long did it take for you to get from, not whittling down your savings and in your, little mini retirement to, okay, I'm paying myself now. I'm paying employees. We're growing. What was that realization? And, I know you never really feel like you've made it. At least that's been my experience, but where there's a degree of confidence and like, I'm doing the right things. This is compounding. We're growing.
Yeah, this is a surprisingly personal question, because I remember, I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I remember this experience where we launched on Gumroad, and later on we launched on Stripe. So we have this sort of hybrid monetization model. And I remember hitting, maybe it was 2,500 or 3K MRR at the time. And it felt like, I've always been a frugal person. It felt like we were default alive, as long as like we didn't take on any crazy expenses or anything like that. And by we, I mean I at that point, because it was just me. Yeah. But like it's a going concern, and it felt that way. But it also felt like, because I depleted my savings from mini retirement, and 3K by no means is a lot of money or a lot of recurring revenue. If there was a family emergency or a personal emergency, I wouldn't say I'm wiped out, because again, it's a going concern, but there are just things, there are problems I can't remedy at that point, a lot of problems that I can't remedy at that point. And then I remember hitting around 10K, and it felt different, of At that point, it felt like no matter what happened, and I know there are a ton of exceptions, but it wouldn't die, right? And it's also not a thing where it's like I'm thinking about every purchase or thinking about every expense. And I've always been like a sort of quality over quantity type of person where I'm willing to spend more on like a quality service or a quality product. But even those decisions became easier, even though I was already inclined to that line of thinking. So I would say around 10K MRR. And I don't remember how long it took us to hit that. Maybe it was either like a few months before the first year, or a few months after the first year.
Right, right. Okay, yeah, no, that's 10K is definitely one of the big milestones for sure. And did you have already one of your employees at this point, or what did that come afterwards?
Yeah, I think that came around maybe 6 or 7K MR that we ended up hiring our first operations person. Yep.
Right, right, very cool. And since then, you've obviously continued growing. I want to talk about maybe what are some of your challenges now. When you look at growth, you've evolved from being kind of a solopreneur to having a team now. How do you think about splitting your time from working in the business versus on the business? Are you still making content? What does your life look like now, insofar as Trends VC?
Yeah. So, oh man, this is it's fairly fresh, but it was a very painful process finding analysts where this is what I spent 80%, 85% of my time on building reports. When I was the only analyst and the only person writing reports, there's a ton of work that go into putting these together. And it took a very, very, very long time to find analysts that we could work with. Like I remember it was my birthday last year, last Halloween. And I remember working on the job post like before I went out that night for my birthday. And I don't think it was until June of this year where we actually found an analyst that we could work with. And there were just a ton of iterations and ton of people that we had to cycle through and test until we eventually found it. But I would say that was a big inflection point because it just freed up a lot of time where you talked about working in the business versus on the business. And it went from, okay, you're on this treadmill where you have to sort of meet table stakes and put these reports out to, do I want to spend my time improving operations or improving sales, or which experiment should I run? So that freed up a ton of time. And now current challenges, I think I've always, and I think a lot of founders struggle from this, even before you have traction, is around ignoring sales and putting more time into operations. I think because how would I put this? It relates back to comfort challenges where with sales, like the feedback loop is more visceral and more in your face, and like failing is more obvious versus if you like need to make this make scenario or zap more efficient, there's a direct feedback loop and it worked. There's like an objective done there, where it's just not so much with sales and marketing. So I would say current challenges are around just running more sales experiments. I would love to get to the point where even though we have analysts, I would love to build a 3-month backlog of reports. We just launched a new series called Founder Finds. I would love to just like square these things away. Sponsorships as well. And that goes a little bit to the sales side where I would love to have sponsorships pre-sold for the next 3 months. And we can get into these longer term bets like side project marketing, whether we're putting together directories or engineering as marketing type things, investing in understanding SEO more, and just feeding the flywheel once we just have table stakes covered.
Right. So this is a area that I feel quite comfortable in being. I come from a sales and marketing background. So let's dive into this a little bit. I think that's, my perspective when I kind of started getting involved in marketing, I went from being a creative person. So I used to tour in bands, and my first business I launched was a photography studio. And so like creative person who ended up in advertising after a lot of things. But, I always saw sales as like the lifeblood, right? Like if I can get money, then me and my friends can all keep being creative and we can make cool shit. And I got really excited about, being, having some skill in it. I think I had some just ability in sales and convincing people to give me money for whatever reason. I guess I got a trustworthy face or whatever. So I kind of found my way into marketing and sales, and I always played that role, even when I was doing the creative stuff. But it is a big hurdle for a lot of founders, particularly like product oriented founders, people who come from a software background or they're engineers. Like, marketing is a little gray. It's hard to wrap your head around. There's a lot of things that are not easy to quantify in terms of like return on my investment and how quick is this going to work. So what has your journey been going from a background in being kind of a software engineer to, growing a company and I guess needing to learn sales and marketing? And do you currently do sales and marketing within your org, or do you have somebody else that does that?
Yeah, so I currently do it, and the path was hard. Where I can't say now that I still appreciate the full, I guess, importance of sales and marketing. Where I was nodding my head yes when you said it's the lifeblood of the business, and I completely agree. But I think we got lucky early on in a lot of ways, stumbling on the Twitter thread growth strategy, where that was kind of just sawdust for us. It was part of the process, and there wasn't too much thinking, or I wouldn't say creativity, because within the threads we would try different things out, but there wasn't this like long, painful, iterative process for us to find a channel that worked for us. Product hunt would have to be the second one. And for a very long time, if someone would ask, like, what's the like main channel of marketing, it was Twitter and word of mouth. And word of mouth was sort of a cop out. I didn't really understand attribution. I still don't fully understand attribution. And I think the fact that we had these crutches early on, I didn't have to pay attention to sales or marketing that much. Things were just growing on their own in a way. I also think that it's a reason why Trends.vc was a content business and that took off while the SaaS companies didn't, because it's like our product is content, and it's almost like I don't want to say screaming, but we're putting a message out, we're pushing something out as part of that. So with a SaaS company, it's like that would be a separate arm or a separate muscle, and it's easier to get wrapped up in adding features. But in a way, like content is our feature. And especially if you have sort of like a stem cell or an existing audience, people will talk about it, people will share it, and that becomes its own flywheel in a way. But yeah, one thing that helped out a lot was when growth started to slow, and that forced me to think deeper about sales and marketing. And I went back, and I forgot who was the first person to say it, but you hear it from a lot of people now. And it's usually advice to software developers, where they say, even before you close a full loop and you have a functioning product, spend half of your time on sales and half of your time on marketing. And I've even mentioned that in previous reports, and I wasn't taking my own advice. And then things started to change there. And I think my most recent sort of change in the way that I function or operate is that I have this, it was inspired by the book, The One Thing, where I have one thing to do each day. And of course, there are other things that I have to do, but like I reserve 3 hours a day in the beginning of the day for that thing. And most of the time it's sales related.
Right. And in terms of like, now you're going through this process, I guess, a bit more now in trying to help grow the business. Are there certain resources that you look to? Were there certain books? How are you learning marketing and sales? Where are you looking?
Yeah, a lot of the topics when I was writing reports, a lot of the topics that I would pick would be selfish topics where it's like, oh, marketing funnels, let's understand this, let's do a report on it. And sort of like the paid newsletter report, where you come out of that with a deeper understanding. And a question I would get a lot early on was, hey, like, how much are we comprehending from what you learned in the report? And I don't think it was even 80%, because if you look at the reports, they're fairly concise, especially relative to where they start out at. It could be 15,000, 20,000 words that we condense into 2,000 words. So there are a lot of examples and things that are lower signal, but still add to this sort of mosaic that are missing from the report. And you pick all of that up again when you have to learn it, synthesize it, and then like reteach it to other people. So that was sort of my learning flywheel of consuming all of these podcasts, all of these essays, a lot of times books, and then trying to teach in a concise way those concepts back to people.
So what is working for you right now? What is some of the newer channels that you've added or newer activities that you've kind of evolved into?
Yeah, one of the most important things that we did was the adding of email sequences. So even once, and this helped a lot, made the decision easier to go from weekly reports to biweekly reports, was even once we made that decision, we had a backlog of maybe 40 or 50 reports at that point, and we can build out an email sequence where on a weekly basis, we were touching point with new subscribers. So that goes into like staying top of mind. There's a call to action to convert to Trends Pro in each email as part of that sequence. So I think that's a big thing. Twitter is still pretty effective for us. And unfortunately, I still haven't put all the attribution in place. So even though I understand that we get about 30 to 60 new free email subscribers on a daily basis, I don't fully understand where all of those come from. Some come from the way that we run the newsletter. Each report is also published as like a blog, if you will, and it's SEO discoverable. So we have pop-ups and call to actions to subscribe to the newsletter from there. But yeah, I don't have a like full handle on attribution yet.
Great. Yeah. Attribution is one of those funny things. I've had more conversations on the topic of attribution than I care to ever have. And I'm kind of like so when I started in advertising, I came from like a performance marketing background. So like buying media, doing paid acquisition, all that kind of stuff for big companies like Procter and Gamble and big banks and fintech companies and all kinds of stuff. But and so attribution was a really hot topic because it was just so seductive, this idea that I can measure everything and I can know exactly where something comes from. And if it's working, I can just dump more money in it and basically build money printing machines was what it felt like, at least in its heyday. Let's say like 2013 to 2015, 16 was when I think the paid acquisition was really working. But attribution is one of those weird topics because the more I learn and the more I dug into it, I figured out that you say you don't have attribution figured out. The inside secret is nobody's got attribution figured out. People got ideas and philosophies and models, as many as people have philosophies on how to live their life, right? It's just like everyone sees it a different way and it's hard to find consensus. It's getting harder to do attribution, frankly. And a lot of the things that I've observed that actually drive affinity for a brand and help you grow long-term, like sustainably. A lot of those activities can't be measured. And so where I've seen a lot of founders get stuck is like wanting to attribute every penny. And it's like, I'm not going to do any marketing unless I know that this first $5,000 I spend is going to return me 10, or that next 20, like why invest in content? I can't see that it's, returning any customers tomorrow from that newsletter I sent out last week. And so I think that sometimes not understanding attribution might mean you do the actual things that help you grow as opposed to obsessing over it. So it might actually be a blessing in disguise when you say I don't get attribution. I always tell people like don't overthink it and do things that really make sense. And if your business is growing in aggregate, then you're probably doing the right types of activities. And obviously that changes when you're doing a lot of different channels and paid activities. You obviously need to have some data to go from, but yeah, attribution is one of those very hairy topics.
Yeah. And just to reinforce your point, there are things like 100 Rules to Live By that I wrote years ago that are just getting shared now, where Kevin Kelly shared it. I believe Morning Brew shared it in the last month. And it's been one of our fastest growing months in terms of email subscribers. But when I did that, I didn't have in mind that like, hey, months later, I'm doing this because of this. It's just like value delivered from a person who happens to run this company. And they mentioned Trends.vc, which like led to that. But like you said, looking in aggregate. So it helps to hear that.
That's great. That's great. What has been maybe some of you mentioned you have a new, like you were thinking about a North Star metric recently. Mm-hmm. Have you changed that metric? And what are maybe some stories or examples of where you've had a hard time growing that metric and maybe some things that you did?
Yeah, so we've had a North Star metric for about 3 months now. And I look at North Star metrics and North Stars as being a little different, where the North Star metric for us is engaged email subscribers. And that's anyone who has opened, I believe it's opened or clicked. It may be open and clicked, but open or clicked one of our emails in the last 30 days. So that's our North Star metric. And I tend to think of North Stars as they can, or like they don't have to align with your North Star metric. It's a more personal thing where, as you know, like being a part of leadership groups before, sometimes the thing that you want to talk about in the group is like not even with business. It's like this is a limiting factor or sort of a bottleneck for something that's going on in business. And your North Star could be something personal, right? Like maybe you're struggling to disconnect from your computer and your like phone to get to sleep on time. Like that's an example for me, something I've been struggling with recently. So I understand that if this happens, the cascading effects and benefits of that thing will bleed into business. But that could be a North Star for me to figure out a way to consistently do that, you know?
Right. And any hurdles that you've had or plateaus on growing that engaged email subscriber list, and maybe some things that you did to get around that?
Yeah, this one is very fresh, where as soon as we identified that as a North Star metric, and it wasn't the first thing I would suggest to people, if you're thinking about what your North Star metric should be, don't think too long because the first version may not survive anyway. Just pick something and sort of like course correct as you go. But it became really obvious the flip side of going from weekly to biweekly reports. And the reason why I made that decision early on was to be able to dedicate time to working on the business, to create a little breathing room. The downside to that is that you just slow down the flywheel where you're not top of mind as much. You don't have as many touch points, so you get less conversions. And that was the sort of the other side of the flip side of that decision. And then I don't think it's a coincidence that I started quickly thinking about a curated newsletter, something that would take less effort, but still allow us to increase that cadence as soon as we identified that North Star metric. And that's the thing. I also started playing around with this idea that I have more confidence in now than last week of like content efficiency, where reports, the amount of effort invested is very high. The amount of value that people get from those reports, especially if you're looking at building a micro private equity firm and we release a report with 60 hours of research in it, hopefully you get a lot of value out of that. So that's high as well. But with the curated newsletter, it feels like the amount of value may be medium versus high, but the amount of effort is low. So that ratio is a lot higher. And if you're looking at building a business, the like margins, everything else, it makes sense to go after the curated newsletter. And the reason why I mentioned last week was because that's the first issue of Founder Finds that it's went out. And based on that first issue, engagement based on clicks is 3 times higher than reports, which take a multiple of I don't know how many times more effort to create. So I'm already thinking long term, like how do I allocate like time, money, energy, knowing that, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I know we're getting close, so I have a few kind of more rapid fire type questions. What are some of the coolest businesses you've seen perhaps spun out of some of the reports that you kind of put out there into the world? Yeah, I'd love to hear some stories.
The first example that came to mind, and I actually met this guy, I used to do report reviews. So I would draft a report and then walk through the report on a call with someone to get their feedback. And that just like shored up or strengthened the report. And this one guy, it may have been the second version of second report that we did on NFTs, the second edition. He ended up discovering NFTs and building a business framing NFTs. So you can get like a picture frame of your NFT in your bedroom, in your living room. That's one example that comes to mind. Another example is XO Capital, where Andrew started that with a few partners a few months after we released that report. And he talked about discovering that model where, sort of like me, he was very big on starting SaaS companies, and he realized that he could reduce market risk by just buying something that's working. And they've raised, I don't know how many rounds of capital and have how many portfolio companies under their belt now.
Wow, that's really cool. What trends are you most excited about right now?
Yeah, I'm a pretty plain guy where a lot of stuff that I've mentioned may be like duh, but that's the reason why I'm excited. Like cliches are true a lot of times. So no code, I think about just individual leverage, like the amount we would have had to hire a lot sooner if it wasn't for sort of no code as a phenomenon. So that's one thing. I'm also very, very interested in DeFi and the idea of just digital rights. It's one of those 0 to 1 moments where this wasn't a thing before, like copy and paste was real. Now it's mine. And we still have like, it's becoming less and less of a misconception but you have true digital property rights that you can prove now. And I don't even think we're 1% into understanding the implications of what that means. So no code, DeFi, what else? This is vague and we haven't done a report on it, but this idea of like permissionlessness, where with podcasts, like, okay, bandwidth is limited, everyone can have a radio show, now everyone can. Now everyone can have a TV show. Now it's like this idea of not having to ask permission. And we talked about comfort challenges earlier, but I think if you understand comfort challenges and you also understand what's happening where you no longer have to ask permission for things, information is abundant. It's just a matter of who's going to do it and who's not, like who's going to pull the trigger, who's going to have the courage to do it. And that's the limiting factor now, it feels, not access or information.
Very cool. Yeah, I love that one. I know when I was coming up as a musician, it was like the gatekeepers were the big record label, right? And just to see how much that has changed in the past while is incredible, right? Like you can put music out every day if you wanted to and get direct access to an audience. They can buy, tickets from you or NFTs from you that get them access to whatever. And it's quite remarkable, the permissionlessness that we have, all of the opportunities around it. All right, one last thing before we go. What is some advice you would give a budding solopreneur, maybe somebody who was a software engineer, has some ideas and wants to make that leap? What would be some advice for them?
Yeah, I would say focus on what you can control. So a lot of times that way that manifests for founders early on is you don't control whether something will work, a business will work, or an experiment will work, but you control the inputs. How many experiments do you run? How many iterations do you conduct or do you perform? So focus on what you can control. Something that I thought about recently for the first time in a long time was that it feels like I've been avoiding setting output-based goals. And I'm still not sure of whether I'm going to do that, but to relate that back to focus on what you can control, I feel more comfortable setting output-based goals of, I want to hit this revenue milestone or number of subscribers, which I don't directly control, but I can ask myself, what habits or conditions can I create to make that possible or to make that almost certain? Even if you end up overshooting, you might as well overshoot, right? So that's a way to, in addition to focusing on sort of extrinsic feedback or having an outer scorecard, that stems from this input-based way of thinking, if you will.
Wonderful. No, I love that. That's great. Thank you so much. If people want to find you online, where should they go?
DRURLY on Twitter, or just check out trends.vc.
Cool. Thank you very much. Very thankful to have you on at the Growth Summit. And hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Likewise. Thanks, Ian.
Perfect. Cut. We're good. Thank you very much.
Cool.
That was great. That was
Yeah.
great. Really nice hearing your journey and kind of where the different milestones happened, and just seeing all that you've accomplished in a fairly short amount of time is quite incredible. You said 2017 is when you got cracking, right?
That was mini retirement. Trends.vc started in 2020. Yeah, February.
So a couple of years in. Wow, incredible! It must be really nice to see how big it's grown. Is there anything I can do for you? Any questions you have for me? Anything on your mind?
No, just like when this gets shared, I would love if you could CC me, maybe I could reboost it on Twitter or something like that. So yeah, just keep me posted, and yeah, good luck on the move to Portugal. Would love a 6 months in, 1 year in recap of your experience there.
I will do that. I'm speaking about starting your own show or whatever. My wife and I have been talking about sharing a lot of our experiences on why are we going and what's like to head out there. And I'm working on a bit of a side project right now for fathers. So I'm obviously, I got 2 kids now, so thinking about being a father, being a parent is very front and center. And so I'm going to be coming up with a bunch of content around that. And part of that is the decision to head over to Portugal. But yeah.
Nice. Yeah, would love to be a fly on the wall. So when you pull the trigger, if you could just shoot me a link. I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Wonderful. Well, let's stay in touch, man. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Ian, bye.
Cheers. Bye.